The proposition wants you to believe that this debate is simple. They want you to think that the only choice the student in Indonesia have is either take students loan or lose access to education completely. But that framing is fundamentally dishonest because this debate is not about whether education matters. We all agree that it does. But this debate is about whether the solution to inequality in education is to make young Indonesians begin adulthood in debt. And on opposition, we firmly believe that the answer is no. Before I move to the argument, let's first analyze what proposition is actually asking this country to normalize. They are asking students, many of them who are only 18 years old, to make a financial gamble on their future income in an economy where jobs are unstable, wages are unequal, and opportunities are uncertain. And they call this an empowerment. We call it desperation packaged in the opportunity. Now, proposition spends a lot of time saying that this is not an American model because the American model is still failing in the implementation. But notice something that very important in their speech. They still fundamentally rely on debt. Whether repayment starts later, whether it is income contingent, whether there is a bond to the country, none of that changes that the fact the student still enter adulthood carrying financial obligation before they even stabilize their life. And that matters because that changed the way people live. On opposition, we have two major arguments today. First, student loans institutionalize economic insecurity among young people. Second, student loans allow the government to shift responsibility for education from the state onto individuals. Let's go to the first argument. The proposition tells you that students can repay later on once they get jobs. But this entire argument relies on one dangerous assumption, that graduates will actually get stable and sufficient employment. They will automatically get that if they graduate from the university. But the reality is many graduates struggle to find jobs. Many work in informal sectors, many are underpaid, many do not work in fields related to their degree at all. So what happens then, we ask? The proposition says that don't worry, repayment is gradual, but gradual debt is still a debt. You are still forcing the young people to structure their adult lives around repayment obligation, and this affects every major decision that they're gonna make in the future. They tend to become more afraid to take entrepreneurial risk. They scared to pursue their passion-based career. They scared to support their families. Why? Because they cannot afford failure anymore. And this is especially dangerous in the middle and lower income families. Because the wealthy students already can pay their university upfront, but the people taking this loan, majority of taking people this loan are overwhelmingly the people with the least financial safety net. And so the proposition is not removing inequality, they are delaying the payment of inequality. And this is where their comparative completely fails. They keep saying that at least students can access education, but accessibility built on debt is not necessarily and not a true accessibility. If I tell someone, for example, you may enter the building but you have a financial pressure in your neck to your future, I think that's not a revelation. We believe that is not a true freedom for every people. That is a conditional opportunity. Now let's talk about the second issue, shall we? The commercialization of education. Notice how proposition always talk about university. They say that universities need money, universities need funding, universities need students to pay. But what actually happened here is education stopped to become a public responsibility. They become a transaction. The government is essentially saying that we cannot adequately fund education, so students themselves must finance the system through debt by themselves. And this is extremely dangerous because once debt becomes normalized, universities gain incentive to continuously raise tuition costs. Why? Because students are no longer paying immediately. Payment becomes psychologically distant, and we have already seen this happen in countries with strong, for example, with strong student loan system. The more accessible loans become, the more expensive the education tend to become. So the proposition does not solve the affordability crisis, they risk expanding it. But now let's directly rebut their biggest argument. First, they tell you that scholarships are limited. We agree that scholarships are limited, but the limitation of scholarships does not automatically justify debt. This is a false dichotomy logical fallacy, actually, because the alternative is not only just students' loan or nothing, but actually there are many alternatives that we can find. For example, like expanding public universities, increasing targeted subsidies, tuition caps, vocational education investments, or prioritizing need-based aid. The burden on proposition is not merely to show that loans help some people. Their burden is to prove that this is the best and safest system in Indonesia to implement, and they fail to do so. Second, they say that the government can sustain this because students can repay later. But what happens when graduates cannot repay? What happens? What happens during economic recession? What happens during an unemployment crisis? Either the government takes and absorbs the losses, or students become trapped in long-term debt cycles. And both outcomes are harmful for the future of Indonesia. Third, they argue about even long-term debt is still better than having no education. This is probably the most important statement in the entire debate, because propositions themselves admit that their world creates a long-term debt among young people. They simply argue that the suffering is justified. But on opposition, we reject that logic entirely. Young people should not have to take a risk to their future to simply access education, especially when education is increasingly required for basic economic survival. And finally, let's talk about the bond system. Propositions say that students must stay and contribute to Indonesia because we already pay you for your university, for your education. But to think about what that actually means, you are financially tying people to the state through debt obligation, and this creates coercion. People are no longer freely choosing where they want to work. They are pressured. They are pressured economically into staying, and if the domestic job market itself is weak, then proposition is trapping graduates inside a system that may not even reward them adequately. Now let us weigh this debate clearly. Proposition gives you this short-term access, but the opposition protects long-term security. Because what matters is not merely about whether students can repay can repay and enter university right now, but what actually matters is what kind of life that they have afterward. Does they have an anxiety? Does they have the fear of the obligation that they are getting burdened of? But in proposition world, students enter adulthood carrying financial anxiety before they even build stability. In our world, we reject the normalization of debt as the price of opportunity. We believe that education should empower citizens, not financially burden them, and for those reasons, I am proud to propose